So what I'll do today is I will work from John Paul II, Caro Waltia, his philosophical text before he became Pope called Love and Responsibility. So we'll look at the sexual urge and what it means to use. We'll look at a critique of utilitarianism, especially as it regards the human person, and then an interpretation of the sexual urge. And I got some pretty, easy examples to use for you that I think everybody can relate to. But I also think that tomorrow will be a nice opportunity just to fill in the gaps. So no notes tomorrow, just kind of free form. So what I'll do is I'll bring up what I like to call like the first block, so that way you can get some things written down, and then I'll start talking about them. Caro Waltia, he'll start out by talking about two different versions or meanings of the phrase to use. We'll do the first one, and then towards the bottom of the slide we'll talk about the second one. And I think sometimes, I try my best to start out obvious, where, yes, I get that. Because if we don't start out obvious on something that we agree on, then we can't move away from that. So the meaning of the phrase to use, he says, the first way is to use as a means to an end. All right? You're using it as a means to an end. So I use a car for transportation. I use sneakers so that I can walk across irregular and rough surfaces without hurting my feet. That's obvious, but those are things. We're going to be talking here in terms of people. So the first way is to use it as a means to an end. Now, man has the power of self-determination. That means, let's see, it's non-transferable. Now, I know that might sound a little vague for you. Does anybody know what I mean by something being non-transferable? Yes. Yes, it can't be transferred. It cannot, let's say that I can't will something for you. All right, your power to determine for yourself what it is that you want to do or will do, I cannot take over that power, and you can't take over my power. Now, as a father with 3 young daughters, my youngest one's turning 21 tomorrow. Many times throughout, their dating, I would have very much liked to have stepped in and chosen for them. You can't do that. And I was wise enough to know that I am not going to be the one who opposes the other guy, because that will be glue that holds them together even tighter, right? So, but you can't will something for somebody else. You can't will and choose for me, and I can't will and choose for you. I'm not talking about coercion and all those other things. I'm talking about our ability to determine for ourselves who we are. These powers are also inalienable. What does inalienable mean? What's that? Oh, you're on a roll today. You cannot give it away. Oh, go ahead.
It's everybody's.
Well, it is everybody's, but it's also you can't give it away. All right? Even voluntarily, you cannot give it away. So the power for us to determine for ourselves what we will and who we are, we can't transfer that power to somebody else, and we can't abdicate or give that power away. So we will say then that man is built for gift. Now I know that sounds very, mundane, but we'll talk about gift in the most pedestrian terms. It's something I'm giving you. I once wrote about 130 pages on that, so there's a lot to it. But let's leave it at that. That's fine. Man is built for gift, and he seeks some common good. That's, let's say, that's outside of ourselves. We'll leave it at that. Keep it simple. Man is built for this gift, and he seeks some common good outside of ourselves. So we already talked yesterday how we have this desire to transcend who we are. Okay?
What if these powers are something great?
They can't be given away. All right. So that means then our capacity to love, which in many ways is the same thing as gift. Man's capacity to love means that we have to subordinate that good for the sake of the other person. So we're always looking at this other person's good. Like, how do we love them? So yesterday I talked in terms of surrendering to our spouse. This is like a mutual subordination. Not like, I'm not subordinate to my wife in terms that she dominates me. I'm subordinate to her in the sense that I recognize this value within her, right? So let's do that one. So you get it. The value of the other person is that common good uniting us in love, okay? So I always subordinate myself to the love of the other person, or at least try. We're not good lovers, right? I mean, it's difficult for us to love other people. So the value of the other person, is that common good that unites us in love. I'll finish this slide and then hopefully I can say something about it. He then goes on to say, beyond using as an end to a means, the second meaning of the phrase to use is simply to enjoy. So I have an ice cream because I enjoy eating it. I'll watch a movie because I enjoy the entertainment. So the second meaning of the phrase to use is to enjoy. But the problem here, and this is where the problem is going to start arising, and although I'm talking here in terms of sexual intimacy, this is any type of relationship. If man's view is to isolate and seek pleasure, if that's what we make our goal, then that other person will become a means to an end. We will start to use them as a means to an end. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. So all we're trying to say here is that two different ways we can use someone. We can use them as a means to an end, or we can simply use them for enjoyment or pleasure. You can't advocate that. You can't say, and I'll show you the last slide, you can't even say, I'm okay with this. What if I voluntarily will allow myself to be used because I like what I'm receiving? It's inalienable. It's not something you can transfer to the other person, nor can you give it up. Okay? Okay, anything on that slide before I flip it? Yes?
What does that mean to be, what is the means to an end?
Oh, so, I'm just using somebody to get, my end is my goal. So I will use you to get to wherever my goal is. All right? Nikki, do you have anything?
Yeah. I just had a question. For man's capacity to love himself to that.
That was to that. Let me see. I think I was talking about that common, the common good that unites us. So we're always trying to be transcendent. We're always trying to reach out of ourselves, and we subordinate ourselves. So when I was saying how spouses must be submissive and surrendered to each other, I didn't mean it in some dominant way. It wasn't like I want them to control me. It's almost like I see a value in that person, and I'm submitting myself to that value that I see in them. I know that still kind of sounded vague, but let's get through the next slide. We can wrap it up. So now John Paul II will start a critique of utilitarianism. He'll say, this is what's wrong with it. So this isn't like the Catholic view, all right? A utilitarian will say, the useful is whatever gives pleasure, which becomes an essential ingredient for happiness. I'm hoping hopefully soon this will start making sense. The useful is whatever gives pleasure, and that becomes an essential ingredient for happiness. All right? And the second line is just, therefore, in utilitarianism, to be happy is to live pleasurably. All right? I think that should be simple to think. To be happy is to live pleasurably. All right. So yesterday I told you that, we have this Pollyannish fantasy that life, we should always be happy. It's, we can't live in that sort of world. Marriage is not, there aren't necessarily bad times. You don't get through the good times and hold on to that feeling for the bad times. That's just what marriage is. It's all of that, those experiences. You don't buy a car and expect it to never have an issue. That's unrealistic. If you buy a brand new car and in 2.5 years your brakes are shot and you need to put new tires, you don't say, what the heck happened? That's what owning a car is. Those aren't the bad times. That's part of owning a car. Being in marriage, to have these things that arise where it's not always, happy, as we see pleasurable, we expect that. All right? So the reason why we bring it up here is because if you live a utilitarian life where you're always seeking pleasure, there's going to be, you're going to have to pay out on this somehow. Something's going to have to give. Now, before I go on any more about that, let me say what is now good about pleasure. All right? Pleasure is essentially incidental. That means it's not essential. It happens. So in other words, it's something that happens in the course of the action. It's something that happens in the course of the action. So, for instance, did anybody ever go to a Potbelly Subs? Anybody ever eat one of those places? There's one in Philly. It was unbelievable. Why did me and my wife stop at the sandwich shop? We were hungry. Did I eat and expect to receive pleasure? Yes. I wasn't going in there for pieces of wax. All right? But now let me ask you something. If I told you I eat only because I like the pleasure of eating, what would you think of that? Yeah, there's a disorder there, right? I mean, you would think there's something wrong there. But in human sexuality, we don't always make that connection. So in human sexuality, should the act be pleasurable? Yes. It's meant to be pleasurable. But if pleasure is the goal, and a person says, I enter the act for pleasure, why don't we consider that to be disordered? Anybody ever watch Seinfeld? Jerry, you did? Molly? Okay. I've only ever seen this episode once or twice. You might find this funny, but it's pretty poignant. He was talking, you know how he does his stand-up routines. Like he'll have the shows going on as a sitcom, but then they'll flash back to him on stage doing stand-up. So he does a stand-up about pornography. And he starts to say, I don't understand it. You look at a magazine or a movie where people are having pleasure, you can never experience that pleasure. But you're watching it. He goes, wouldn't that be as odd as going outside of a restaurant and watching somebody eat a delicious steak through the glass and saying, wow, look how good that is? There's a point there. I mean, you're not in that experience. So his point is, when it's only in it for pleasure, there's something there that's missing. All right? But yet, you should experience it. Like if you guys pick virtue theory, right? We'll talk about how food and sex are both governed by the temperance, which is the cardinal virtue of temperance. Okay? That's one of the lowest, because they're hierarchical, and temperance is the lowest of the virtues. Which means it's not that serious of a sin. It might be a sin, but it's not that serious of a sin. Why? Because it's based around something that we need, right? Food is desirable, but we eat it because we need nutrition. Sex is pleasurable, but that can't be the reason why one enters into it. And I'm going to show you what the problem is, because you might be thinking, well, why not, right? Well, look at that. So anyway, these are drives within us. I mean, if we really want to be speculative, we could say that God could have made food taste like wax and sex just, unpleasurable. And then nobody would want to eat, and we would not procreate. We'd have to almost convince somebody, to do it. But it's not that. So these actions are based around things that are quite pleasurable, but we get the pleasure mixed up with the goal. So there are times when utilitarianism, remember we talked about this yesterday, mutual egoism, right? It can even be the harmonization of egos. And that has the semblance of altruism, doing something good and grand. So utilitarianism could even be the harmonization of egos, and it gives the semblance of altruism. So, what's wrong with two people, even if they're in an act, but if they're both having pleasure? What's wrong with that? Well, you can't abdicate that. You can't give that up. It's something inalienable. Yes, dear?
It's the harmonization of egos and gives.
Well, a semblance. S-E-M-B-L-E-N-C, like a semblance of altruism. It's almost like it looks like it's a good thing. We don't understand, why is this not a good thing? And here's why. All right? Now, you should be getting, like, the philosophical psychology behind this that John Paul II, like, if you were to tell somebody, like, if I were to read you, like, premarital sex, fornication is wrong, it's a sin, this and that, okay, I disagree, but I get it. I'm trying to give you the understandings, like, what happens to the human person underneath that, all right? If one person ceases to experience pleasure, this is the problem, even if it looks like, well, we're both okay with it. If one person ceases to experience pleasure, then the one will be indifferent to the other's pleasure. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Then they will be indifferent to the other person's pleasure. Now, I'm going to give you a stereotypical sexist analogy for this. It's probably true for some people, but you'll get it. Men and women look for different things in a relationship, okay? So let's just say that there's this man and woman, it's a couple, and they're in this together because they both they like the time together. They receive pleasure about being together and dating, so they go steady. But after a while, the woman starts to feel like she's being used or underappreciated, all right? Because we all have this, because this is built into us, we have a real knee-jerk reaction to being used, which is kind of his point. So she goes to her boyfriend and says, this isn't working. Something has to change here. And the guy is absolutely indifferent to it. He's like, what are you talking about? Everything's fine. Nothing has to change. What's wrong with it? Can't it just be like it is now? Okay? Now, what's happening there? The man has not changed his pleasure. He's still receiving pleasure out of his relationship. The other person is not experiencing pleasure. The one that is becomes indifferent to their plight. They don't recognize it. Why? That's how you can tell you're in a relationship that's based on pleasure. Because the minute that one starts to wane, the other one's almost indifferent to it. What are you talking about? We're fine. Just things can keep going on like they are, right? At that moment there's something there that's missing, and the other person, you have now become indifferent to their pleasure. So this is even true if two people are so-called using each other, right? The mutual sense of egoism. Like I said, I had a friend their friend was a prostitute. And she kind of took umbrage in saying, I'm not being used. I'm going into this. Now, we could argue how free that was, but she said, I've chosen this, so what's the big deal? Well, because you can't give that up. It's inalienable. You can't just say, I'll give that away. You have the power for that, and somebody else, it's non-transferable. So even in that sense, right, even in that relationship, there's still a sense that until one of them isn't getting the pleasure out of it, then there's going to be a semblance I'll use the other person. So John Paul II says, as a response to this, he says what he calls the personalistic norm. The personalistic norm says the only response to a person is love. That's it. The only response to a person is love. It is what separates us from other mammals, all right? We might read into them. We might see affection between them. We might say, well, that chimpanzee looks like it loves this chimpanzee. But we probably really don't think that, because if that chimpanzee then were to be with someone else, we wouldn't say, oh, look, now he's cheating. In other words, we watch how far we push these analogies, right? So a person's rightful due is to be treated as an object of love, not as an object of use. Not as an object of use. So what does marriage entail then? Marriage entails like something, there's a form and a structure there that doesn't entirely safeguard it, but it makes it safer, right? For two people to be subordinate to each other. Wasn't living together a commitment? Not in the least. Because you can walk out any minute. But they said they wouldn't say anything, right? If you can break a marriage contract, you can easily break, I'm walking out. So the whole thing here is, the critique of utilitarianism is if it's based on pleasure, then we're going to have to ask the question, what happens when the pleasure is no longer, equal between the two? When one feels like they are being used and they are not getting pleasure out of this, then the whole thing kind of disrupts. And then the person who's still receiving pleasure They're almost indifferent to the other person's plight. All right. Last slide. I think we're all tired. I know I am. Okay, so nothing really insightful on the first line. I'm just giving you the etymology. That Latin word simply has the meaning of, to urge or desire. Now, it has the meaning of urge or desire. Now, because man is capable to decide for himself, because we are self-determining, all right? This urge always seems to be in conflict with our freedom. Because we're always trying to work out, do we give in to the urge? Do we resist the urge? We're always trying to work out this, teeter-totter thing between our urge and our freedom. But the reality is we are capable as humans of rising above our instincts. We already said that when I went over Imago Dei, okay? We don't have to give in to our instincts. We have rationality. Yes?
What was the second one?
Because man is capable to decide for himself, this urge. What did I say? My mind just went blank. Did I not go over that? Didn't I?
Well, I think you said it. But
Oh, yeah, I did. This urge is in conflict with your freedom. Yeah, I did say that. It's amazing how quickly your mind goes. So we are capable of rising above our instincts, or if that's not true, then morality would have no meaning. Okay? Morality would simply have no meaning, and this course, whether you like it or not, would be absolutely ridiculously stupid. Because if everything was just instinctual, then we can't be held accountable for anything of our morality. So I'm not trying to be crass, but if you saw two dogs, mating in the neighbor's front yard, you don't think to yourself, they really shouldn't be doing that. I should go over and say something to the dogs. Now, as silly as that is, the fact that you don't think that reveals that you realize they're being instinctual. Okay? I mean, like I was talking to a biological anthropologist once who really thought, that since we're so close to chimpanzees and such, that they have many of, more than I thought of the senses and feelings that we have. But I don't really agree. Like, in other words, I realize that they share 96% of our DNA. But let's be honest, without being flippant, it does take a scientist to explain that, but you can get a child to explain what the difference is between the two. And I don't think that, we might think it's cute that a chimpanzee is with another chimpanzee. Look, they love each other. But we never hold them accountable. We never accuse a chimpanzee of adultery. We never accuse a chimpanzee or any other animal of murder. And the reason why we don't is because we don't expect them to rise above their instincts. But humans, we do. So in other words, if you breed dogs, like I'm talking, in a rightful way where you're having them registered and everything, if you don't want this one to breed with that one, when one of them is in heat, you remove that one. You don't just explain to them, because the dog will do what a dog instinctually does. It's not true with humans. So that's why morality applies to us. All right. So sexual attraction makes obvious the fact that the attributes of the sexes are complementary. All right? It makes obvious the fact that the attributes of the sexes are complementary. Now, we will not get into any of the sexual differences or any of that stuff today. But I do just at least want you to know this. The Catholic Church does not boil down sexual difference to anatomy. Okay? That is not the whole of the sexual difference. But that being said, it is part of the sexual difference. All right? We can't dismiss it either. So what we'll say then is the sexual urge has the tendency to develop in love because it's between persons. This is not between two, chimpanzees. It has the ability and capacity and the tendency to develop into love because it is between persons. And this is really the telltale lead into one of the dystopian novels that I'm thinking about. If the sexual urge were simply something biological, okay, if there was no pleasure attached to it, and people only mated like animals do, then it could be used as a means to an end. There's no harm in that. So we all the time, breeders do this, of dogs and other animals. They breed them, put them together, and they want that sexual act to achieve an end. We need this breed of dog. I want to keep the line of this dog, pure, or whatever it is that they say. So tomorrow I'll talk more about this, but I'll talk about one of the dystopian novels where it kind of gets this way. It gets mechanical. And you guys know what an avatar is, right?
The blue people?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, not the blue people, but representation of something. They have, I just read, because I try to keep up on the bioethics of it too, they just invented, if you want to call it that, something that's called an avatar. They have built an organic reproductive system of a woman. So they actually, through donated wombs, uterus, fallopian tubes, cervix, and such, and their goal with this really is to test various medicines and treatments. So what they can see it happening here organically, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. Now they asked this particular scientist who was part of the team, do you have any intentions of ever creating an artificial womb? He said, absolutely not. See, that wasn't the right question. They should have asked him, can you foresee anybody trying to establish an artificial womb? He probably would have said, well, we won't, but I imagine somebody will try. So that is happening sooner than I thought. So who knows? Maybe we are only 10, 20 years away from an artificial womb where we can almost remove the sexual act from reproduction altogether. Right now, we could remove reproduction from the act proper by contracepting or sterilization, and we can actually have the reproductive act, if you want to call it that, occur in test tubes or what we'd say petri dishes, but it still has to return to the woman. Will we reach the point, and we will, I'm not sure how long, where the entire process can happen outside of two people, and all the ethical implications that follow that. So anyway, and all of this would fall in line then too. That's interesting. So this personalistic norm, this fact that we are made for love and in love, it's bound up with the very existence and respect of a person, okay? It's bound up with the very existence and respect of the person. So we're going to say it cannot be used in the absence of love. So, okay, two young people having premarital sex, they're inevitably going to keep repeating themselves. They love each other. But that love is probably more based on pleasure. Because it takes too long for that love to develop. When I asked my wife, then girlfriend, to marry me, I remember thinking at the moment, you can't love somebody more than this. Well, just within a year and a half or two when I got married, I already realized that was sort of naive. I already loved her more than I did when I asked her. I thought that 3 years, 10 years, 20 years. I was lucky enough to grow up in an area where my various generations lived in the same house, and my friend's grandparents were married 76 years. They died 2 weeks apart of natural causes. I think of a fictitious, if I can make up a conversation with them, if I said to them, when did you start to really understand what love was? They'd probably say to me, how long you been married, kid? I'd say 28 years, and they'd say, you're starting to figure it out, aren't you? And I think they're right. So my point here is that two young people, I know it'd be a real mood killer, but rather than saying I love you, to be intellectually honest and emotionally honest, you should be saying I'm having pleasure along your side. Because the minute that the pleasure there starts to be in imbalance, it's going to end that. Right? So we could talk about the sin of premarital sex, but you're just hearing that as a rule. When you start to hear what's at stake, that no one likes to be used, and the minute that the girl or guy senses they are being used, in other words, the only reason you want to stay with me is because you like the physical activity. Once the woman recognizes that, she is already recognizing, I'm being used. If the man replies, no, that's not just it. What's wrong? Why isn't everything fine? He's already in a state where he is already pleasured. So he is becoming indifferent to the other person's sense of pleasure. That's the problem with that imbalance. So the woman is being used. And Tia steps in and says, the only proper response to another human person is love. Not that. Not using. All right? Marriage changes some of that. At least puts it in a different context, okay? If it's found to be a nuisance, in other words, if it's easier just to have people, and achieve pleasure between two rather than work on the sense of love, it's going to have a damaging effect on the people involved. It will have a damaging effect on the people involved. Everybody knows stories of guys or girls who have, had their so-called hearts broken. It's usually, let's be sincere about this, there's usually physical contact involved in all those relationships. The continual sense of being used, it whittles down your self-esteem and worth. That's all this is trying to protect. All right? So anyway, any questions on any of that? All right, that's it, guys.